Now let's say the requirement is to build this full addressing full name as that we want to precede it with the title. There's the title there. Now I'm going to show you how to do that, and in doing so I'm going to introduce you to the concept of nulls and operations involving nulls and why they generally don't work and you've got to code around it. Now this is an important lesson that we've really got to take notice of, because you could be the best SQL developer in the world, and if you don't take account of nulls you can end up having major problems. Okay, so the job is we've got to take title and whack it onto the front there, onto the front of our first initial there. I will just put title, just select title in front there so we can see that as a separate column to the left of full name, just so I can demonstrate what's going on here. So I'm going to go title. Okay, again it is perfectly legitimate to have the same column listed twice in a query. There's some advanced exceptions to that where you actually can't, but again that's a very advanced topic, we'll come to that much later on. So with title there, okay, so the idea is I want to take that title and build it into my full name expression here. So I am going to put title in front of, this is my expression, I'm going to build on my expression, title space plus space literal piece of constant text. So it's a space and end that with a single quote and concatenate that onto the front of the rest of our expression. So it's going to end up being Mr. space B Sanchez, so on and so forth. Now pay close attention to these guys here, K Sanchez, D Duffy and G Erickson. Just focus on these guys here. These guys all have a null. In other words, no title. There is an absence of a value. That's that black hole I was talking about. Whereas G. Erickson and Goldberg below him, they actually have a title. So let's just look at the results for these guys when I execute. Now, the first four actually had a full name, and now they don't. We had text there, and it suddenly turned to null. But Erickson and Goldberg, they didn't turn to null. It's actually worked. There's our title. But for the other one, not only did it not work, it appears to have wiped out our work altogether. What happened to the value that was there? Well, it comes down to the rules governing nulls. So let's revisit the discussion about nulls. Null, when you see it in a database, is not a value. Null is the absence of a value. It's like a little black hole in space. There's nothing in there. No, it's basically a vacuum. There's nothing in there. There's no light. There's nothing. And because there's nothing, there is no value to compare it with. And because of that, when I was studying databases at university, our lecturer made us stand up and recite the following, and I'm going to do the same for you. Null equals nothing, and nothing equals null. So I'm going to repeat that. Null equals nothing, and nothing equals null. Null is not capable of equaling anything, because that implies that null has some sort of a value that you can compare it to something, but it doesn't. It has no value. There's nothing in there. It can't be compared to anything, and you can't use it in any sort of equals operations. So I'll talk a little bit about searching for nulls, because if null equals nothing, well, how do we select for it? How do we detect it in our data? Well, there's a bit of a trick to that, and when I've done that, we'll come back and visit what's happened with our little operation where we selected a null. Now, we saw in an earlier example what happens when we try to search for nulls by simply using an equals operator like we do in where clauses, in most where clauses. So if I was to type where title equals null, nothing. Why not? Because, same thing again, null doesn't equal anything. Null equals nothing, and nothing is capable of equaling null. What we can do is we've got the special keyword is null. Hey presto, yes, they're all the ones that are nulls. See, nulls, nulls, null. The rows that actually have a value in title, they're not being returned because they're not null. They actually have a value. So I'll get rid of my where clause. And we're back to all the records. So by putting a null value for these guys and concatenating it with something, the result ended up being null. So what happens when we actually use a null value that happens to be on a record in a row? If we actually use that in an operation, what happens? Well, I can tell you what happens. If you take null and you concatenate it with a piece of text, any text, the result is null. That piece of text could be 1,000,000 characters long. Doesn't matter. You put a null next to it, the result is null. Literally, it's SQL Server's way of saying, hey, this is a black hole. It's almost like the text gets sucked into the black hole and the result is just one big black hole. It's SQL Server's way of saying, hey, I do not know how to handle a null. There's no value. If I take something that's not a value, when I apply it to another value, I have no idea what the hell to do with it, so the result is a null. If you were to take a bit of text and concatenate it with a null on the right hand side, the result is still null. You can have a bit of text and concatenate that with a piece of text and a null and more text, and if there's any nulls in there, you end up with one big fat null in the end. So when you're doing these kinds of operations, you have to allow for nulls. You have to take account of nulls in such a way that it's not going to screw up your value. And if ever you get to the level of writing SQL to supply data to applications, you've got to be very careful, because failure to take account of nulls and returning a null value when you don't mean to, that could result in your application, be it a web application or a .NET desktop application, whatever. It could result in that application crashing at runtime and you have lots of really annoyed users. So we're going to have a bit of a primer here on how to handle nulls. Now, the top line there is looking a bit long, so I'm going to put it on its second line there. Hit tab there to shift it over and line it with the rest of the code. Now, we're going to use another function, and it is called isNull. It's actually colored purple because it's kind of a special system function. And as with all functions, they begin with the name followed by an open bracket. Now, IntelliSense has very kindly given us the metadata for the function, saves us looking it up on Google. And what is the metadata? Well, it accepts two parameters, 1, 2, and then the closed bracket, separated by a comma. It accepts an expression, some sort of a value, customarily some sort of field in the record set, and then a replacement value. In other words, what the function is doing is, if amongst that function it encounters a null, it will substitute in some proper value that is not null. So we're basically stripping out all the nulls. If it does not encounter a null, then it will just leave that expression where it is. So what we're doing is we're going to put in our expression that is polluted with nulls, title, and we're going to put in the replacement that will be used if, and only if, there is a null in that record. So we'll put in, let's say, blank, just to tell us that there's a blank there. And all expressions should, in good practice, have a name for the expression column. So we'll call that fixed title, and let's see what the result is. Right, what's just happened? Now there's a null title there, and we've substituted in a blank. There's a null title there, we've substituted in a blank. There's a null title there. There is not a null there, it's left the original proper good value there. Great. So that is basically all that minus the nulls. And that's going to be our first step to fixing a little expression column. Now, a far better way, and I'm going to show you a trick, a far better way than the word blank is, instead, let's just put in a blank string. I'll show you how to do that. This is an interesting concept, a blank string. So in that string bit of text, I'm going to take out the word blank and just leave those two quotes by themselves. Looks a bit funny? I'll explain and show you the result. Okay, what do we have here? Well, what we've got is kind of a bit of white space. It's shown as white space, but it's not null. And of course the values that actually had a proper value in title, it's left untouched. But the ones that were null, it's got an empty string. So what is an empty string? Well, an empty string is an actual string of text. It's not the same thing as a null. And in SQL, we represent it by single quote, and nothing in between. It's like any other string, it's just got 0 length. And because it's not a null, it's an actual red-blooded object, it can be used in any other operation like any other string, such as concatenating or passing it into a function that requires strings, that sort of thing. Now that we've proved our point about the way null works, let's just remove that as its own column on its own, and we'll just insert it into our full name expression here instead of title. So instead of title, which is polluted with nulls, we'll put in this expression which substitute nulls with a nice string and see what the result is. So I'll just get rid of it in its own column here and see what the result is, what's happened to our full name. Okay, voila. Whereas before, the ones that had null in title, full name that was destroyed with a big fat null, it's now got what we want. There's none of this wiping out of everything. Basically, where there was a title, it's just put in an empty string. So there's an empty string just before the K there. You just can't see it because, well, it's empty. So if you can get your head around that, you're doing well. So let's recap what we've learned about nulls. Nulls cannot be compared to values, and in the same way, they cannot be combined with values either, because if they are, the result is always another null. This, however, can be avoided with the use of the isNull function.